excited to have Madeline on again. This is our fourth webinar now in her series of commonly asked energy storage questions. So with that, Madeline, thanks for jumping on. Let's talk a little bit about energy storage.
Thanks very much, Jamie. Hi, everybody. I hope that you can hear me clearly. Today, I want to talk a little bit about what costs you can expect that are associated with a battery-based system, because battery-based systems are going to become more and more status quo as time moves forward in the PV space. And so I want to kind of set the stage into understanding what kind of costs you can expect or anticipate with a battery-based system rather than a standalone grid tie system. So I'll tell you a little bit about myself. Then I want to talk about kind of setting expectations with a customer and how you can start the conversation with what do they want, what are their basic needs, what are kind of some extra wishes that they might have, and so to make sure that the installer is always on the same page with the end customer. I have sort of this reference to coffee that relates kilowatts and kilowatt hours that I mentioned in our last webinar, and I think it's still relevant. So I'm going to mention that again, then dive into sort of the essential questions around a battery. And there are four kind of questions that really help round out a full system. And so those are kind of something you should have in the back of your mind anytime you're qualifying. And then some more details on what you're looking for specifically with battery-based sizing and selection. So my name's Madeline. I have been with Soligent since November as the energy storage manager. And I've been working on solar plus storage systems throughout my solar career since early 2016. My goal at Soligent is to support installers and support our sales team and end customers to really understand what it means when you're looking at a solar plus storage system and how to compare offerings and make sure that you're getting a system that is going to work for you and be the best based on your considerations. And able to do that, I am in contact with our vendors on a regular basis to make sure that we have the best equipment available for you at all times. So this little infographic is something that I was familiar with when I was in engineering school. And I think that this is sort of a funny yet appropriate little image that can apply to a lot of different scenes. So everyone has their own idea of how something should be accomplished. And in this specific example, you know, these are all different sorts of swings. But if you want a tire swing, but you're really talking about like a swing across two different branches, you have to kind of understand, where is my customer thinking? What am I thinking? How can we all be on the same page? And I think making sure that everyone is on the same page at all times is really important from beginning to end. So I'm gonna just spend this time to kind of set the stage on how we can stay on the same page in terms of what costs you should expect when you're looking at a battery-based system. Here is the coffee analogy. So if I say, I want a cup of coffee, these are all different versions of coffee. But if I say I want a cup of coffee and someone gives me, let's just say an Americano, but I really wanted drip coffee, you know, it's the same and it's different. And I think when we talk about solar, it's really easy to kind of use a term and think everyone is understanding what you're asking. But, you know, even if you look at the example of someone calling a solar panel a panel versus a module, you know, we kind of colloquially will use the phrase solar panels, but is everyone always on the same page when you use that phrase? So in this case, when I say I'm looking for a cup of coffee, making sure that everyone understands exactly what that means is going to help the best outcome. So specifically, I want to make sure that we understand the distinction between kilowatts and kilowatt hours. This is sort of a fundamental beginning to talking about batteries, and it's different than when we've just talked about PV. So when you put PV on your roof, you're producing DC power, and DC power is in the unit of watts or kilowatts. So you have a continuous amount of power up on your roof that's providing power to your inverter at any given time. And the accumulation of power over time gives you energy. So energy is where the hours comes in, a kilowatt hour. So if you have a pump and it requires 1 kilowatt of power to run, and you have a 1 kilowatt solar array on your roof, and let's say the sun is shining from noon till 2, and you're getting all of that full array to power your pump from noon to 2. That would mean that you have a 1 kilowatt load running for a full 2 kilowatt hours. So understanding when to incorporate the hour perspective is really important when talking about batteries. So in this rendition, our full carafe of coffee, or in solar terms, our full battery, is a capacity created in kilowatt hours. And that is what I have for the entire duration of my battery. So if my inverter, the spout, can determine, or I guess the tap in our case, the tap can determine how much or how little energy we want to spill out at a given time. If I open it all the way, that's going to be the maximum amount of kilowatts pouring out. That's going to mean you're going to deplete your total kilowatt hour bank the quickest way possible. So if I have, for example, a 5 kilowatt inverter, and I also have a 5 kilowatt load, if we crank this up and we fully open the inverter, that means that I'm going to be having 5 kilowatts coming out of this battery bank in full blast. And if this were, for example, a 15 kilowatt hour battery bank, that means at the end of 3 hours, I'm going to be depleted. I'm going to be all the way to 0 if we were completely discharging the full extent of this battery. So the kilowatt hours has the ability to last for a lot of different durations. If you only open the inverter a small amount, so if I have a 5 kilowatt inverter, but the loads running right now are only 1 kilowatt worth of needs, that means I could have my 15 kilowatt hour bank running for 15 hours. So making sure there's a clear understanding between the maximum amount of power needs versus, let's say, a continuous amount, you can use those different values to inform how you want to size your battery bank in kilowatt hours. So that's kind of just a little brief overview of these units and why using them properly is really important when talking about inverters versus battery banks. So these are my 4 questions. And these 4 questions are unique questions to a battery-based system. If you're talking about grid tie, you may not be considering these at all. You may be looking at budget, but you wouldn't necessarily care what your loads are, because when you're going grid tie, you just stick as many panels as you can fit on a roof and move on. In our case, especially if you want to be looking at, like, let's say a backup only consideration where the amount of PV you're sizing is dedicated for the sole purpose of powering an emergency battery bank, it's important to answer these questions to make those sizing selections accurate. So the first question is, how much load? What are we powering? You know, if we're just going to stick with the emergency use case just for this example, let's say I want my refrigerator, I want 2 lights, and I want 3 wall outlets. I want to identify ideally what the wattage or a combination of the voltage and amperages for all of those loads. And I want to make sure that that's the case for either a continuous amount of loads or the maximum amount of loads. And that's kind of step one. And it's really important to do that before you kind of try to answer questions 2, 3, and 4, because it sets the stage really beautifully for answering these next 3 questions. So if you don't identify the loads, you're kind of shooting from the hip when it comes to questions 2, 3, and 4. So I really want to make it imperative that identifying the loads in a precise manner is really the first step. Then, what are we using it for? In our case, emergencies only. Identifying that our loads are only powered during emergencies is really a huge important thing to decide, because if on the flip side I said I still want batteries for my fridge, lights, and wall outlets, but I want it to be cycling every single day, that's, magnitudes more cycling. So identifying why you want batteries will help inform the number of cycles you can anticipate over the life of the battery. So how much am I running? Why? For what usage are these loads going to be used with batteries? Okay. Then the next phase is how long do I want my little fridge, light, wall outlet setup to run, let's just say, for a 5-hour period. And I say, I can make it through, let's say, the night, a 5-hour night, what have you. And then in the morning, I'm expecting the sun to come up. And I am understanding that after this 5-hour period, I will no longer have the capacity of the bank that I wanted. Or you could say, I'm prepping. I want these loads to run for 5 days. Fine. You can set it for 5 days, then your bank is going to increase dramatically. So identifying how long you want each of these loads to run is essential to identifying the total capacity of a bank. And then finally is budget. I know talking about the budget is tricky, but when you're looking at just a grid-tied solar system, and we've been used to pricing grid-tied solar systems for, I don't know, let's just say 15 years, it's kind of become standardized to some extent. When it comes to batteries, there's still a ton of variability in the sizing and in the technology. So talking about budget, I would say, especially in the beginning, is really important, because if someone says, I want to be able to run my whole house, or I want to be able to run my kitchen and my air conditioner, but I only want to spend $8,000. Well, that may be an important conversation to have at first. But if you can kind of address that and be able to set expectations with what the amount you can afford is going to provide you, it really smooths things out. Okay. Here is a little snippet of questions 1 through 3. Again, we're going to identify our loads. What are we running? And for how long? Something like a fridge is intermittent. So identifying, let's just say, if you can even come up with a daily usage, and it could be over the course of a 24-hour period, yes, when the compressor on your fridge is running, that's going to be more than when your ice machine is, let's say, running. But coming up with a total accumulation of what you're expecting your loads to perform like over the duration of your system is really helpful. So what are the loads? That's down in this corner. Then what are they used for? Is this for backup? Is this for no net metering, complete self-consumption? Or is this for an evening time of use rate? Identifying that helps inform the cycle, like identifying the cycle life of your batteries. Because if it's for backup, and let's say you're anticipating, I don't know, 5 events a year, and you want the battery to last for 5 years. Okay, you can expect only 25 cycles you can really be more intentional when you can be precise with identifying how many cycles you think you're going to use over the lifespan of a battery bank. So here, this is a snapshot of a sizing tool that I use, and I can share this with anybody who wants it to say, get your customer on page with you of how many days of autonomy, identifying the load voltage. All of these questions will help shape the discussion around your battery-based system. And then again, identifying your loads here, how many, and then the hours per day, here's your runtime. Your runtime will significantly affect the capacity of the bank. Not so much the size of the inverter, kind of the sum of your loads will identify the size of the inverter, and then the amount of time they will run will identify the size of the battery bank. So doing this all in the qualification time is really essential. Okay. I really like this slide, so I want to spend a few minutes looking at it. Let's talk about our typical components for a grid-tied system. So a standard offering might be 6 kilowatts of PV on a 5 kilowatt grid-tied inverter. And the reason you may be comfortable putting 6 kilowatts on a 5 kilowatt inverter is because the AC-DC ratio is kind of in favor of putting a little bit more PV on an inverter to maximize your amount of sun, even considering clipping. And I won't really get into that, but this may be an appropriate setup. 6 kilowatts, 5 kilowatt inverter, great. Our module offering really only can vary if you're looking at like a very high power density module versus kind of a standard offering. So those are your two choices. Fancy high density module or kind of just a standard regular module, if you will. And then if you look at inverters, we could be looking at microinverters, DC optimizers, or a string inverter. Those are pretty much your grid tie gamut. And then racking, again, color, style to some extent is a little variation on racking, but that's kind of going to be your 3 components that are existing in every grid tie system. When we shift gears and think about a battery-based system, again, we're prioritizing the loads. So in the first case, we're prioritizing maximizing the output of the inverter and typically maximizing the amount of PV you can fit on your roof. When you're thinking about the PV, when it comes to a battery pairing, you're often thinking about how much time does the sun have to shine to charge my bank. So in this scenario, if I'm putting 5 kilowatts of PV onto my battery-based inverter, and just for fun, let's say we're doing that from a DC coupled system. Let's say either from just a pure DC input into that inverter or from charge controllers. My 5 kilowatt array is designed to charge my 10 kilowatt hour battery bank in 2 hours. This is an essential point I want to repeat. My loads, which we have identified at 5 kilowatts or less, want to be powered with a 10 kilowatt hour battery bank. The 10 kilowatt hour battery bank will be charged in 2 hours if we have our 5 kilowatt of PV exposed to the sun. In any other instance, I could potentially downsize my PV and say, okay, well, 10 isn't a bit, let's just say 2 for fun. If I just select a 2 kilowatt PV array, then my battery bank will still charge, but it's going to take 5 hours. So I'm really thinking about the ratio or the relationship between sun exposure, the peak sun time during a given season, and how much time it's going to take to fill up my battery. So in, I don't know, Nevada in the summer, 5 sun hours is an acceptable amount. I can expect my battery bank to completely fill in 1 day of sun with a 2 kilowatt array, but maybe if I'm kind of off grid in Anchorage, I don't know, I would rather upsize my PV so that I can take in those little two sun hours that I get. I'm still going to be able to achieve my 10 kilowatt hour battery completion. So I just want to say that, again, you're selecting the PV size based on how much time you think your sun will shine to fill up your battery bank. Because then the inverter, the relationship, typically, let's look at the nighttime, is going to exclusively be between the battery bank and the inverter. So the PV is out of the question when the sun isn't shining. So I'm only driving my power from all of that energy stored in my battery bank. Okay, moving on from that, non sequitur. Again, we're looking at potentially premium or standard modules. But when we're looking at a battery-based inverter, we are caring about our loads. And you likely have selected your grid tie inverter based on the load type, but I want to make sure that we're intentional on identifying the loads needed for backup. So are my backup loads 120 volt, or are my backup loads 208, or are my backup loads 240? Kind of asterisk, if your backup loads are 480, you can address commercial solar plus storage from a different offering. I'm just sticking to residential right now. So figure out what the voltage is of your loads that want battery-based power and select your inverter accordingly. Then we get some options with our batteries here. And I want to focus on the distinctions between battery chemistry, battery size, battery bank total capacity, battery bank size, and enclosures. Battery bank enclosures don't get a lot of love, but we're going to talk about enclosures for a minute, in addition to racking, which you already need. Okay, which I guess you could say the battery enclosure is kind of the equivalent of a battery rack. Okay. Battery chemistry as it pertains to cycle life. There has been really a long history of the lead acid world of batteries, and the lead acid world of batteries is not going away. It's kind of a tried and true, especially for off-grid circumstances, affordable, easy to scale. You know, set your bank, set it and forget it. Okay. Flooded batteries have been around for a very long time, very popular in the off-grid world. However, they need maintenance. They need to be equalized and watered, you know, every few months or so. So flooded is a great option for people who are relatively cost sensitive, but still willing to put in a little bit of effort and maintenance to keep their bank going. So the set it and forget it mindset would not be ideal for a flooded customer, but they last for a very, very long time. So it's kind of hard to find a cycle life answer on a flooded battery because the way you treat them is a really big indicator of how long they're going to last. So I kind of want to talk about the three considerations then. The rate at which you charge and discharge batteries is an important thing to identify. So if we have a pump, let's say, and we're exclusively running a pump at a high amperage, that's going to force the battery bank to discharge at a potentially high rate. That's for the discharge. When you're charging it, that's going to be really just based on how much PV you have. So if you have a bigger array, then you're going to be flowing a lot of amps back into the recharge. So identifying if you're charging or discharging in a quick rate is going to impact the longevity of your battery. So I'm not necessarily going to give you tips, but I'm going to explain kind of different metrics that you should look at when selecting a battery bank. So the total voltage and the total energy usage is important because that kind of relates to your depth of discharge. If I am, I'm really going out here, saying I'm going to get a 100 kilowatt hour battery bank, 100 kilowatt hours. But my load is only going to be needing 1 kilowatt every day. I'm only going to be discharging or using up the energy of my battery bank 1% per cycle. That is just like, let's use an analogy of stretching out a rubber band. I am barely pulling on this rubber band. So by cycling a small amount, so even if it's frequent, let's say, if I discharge 1 kilowatt hour, charge it back up. 1 kilowatt hour, charge it back up. Because it's such a small amount in relationship to the size of the battery bank, the battery can withstand that for a long time. On the flip side, let's say I have a lot of loads on my battery-based load panel, but I typically don't run them all. But my emergency is really bad, and so I'm using everything that's on that load panel. You may deplete the battery to a much higher kilowatt hour than normal. That will affect the longevity of the battery. So if you, even on one instance, discharge the battery, let's say you have a gel battery bank and you discharge it 80% of its capacity, it's not going to kind of rebound. It's not going to come back to its full capacity or its full life because of that one instance. But if it's a backup case, discharging it that much is okay. If you know you're only going to be doing that once in a very blue moon while, or if it's at the end of the life of the battery bank, you do that and you say, okay, I know because of that instance, I'm going to have to consider getting a new bank sooner. Temperature is another biggie. The batteries are temperature sensitive. So evaluating your circumstances, meaning, am I putting the batteries outside? What type of enclosure am I using? What's the operating versus like the optimal size versus the maximum for the battery design considerations? Very important. So don't forget temperature, because it is something that you have to anticipate for to make sure that the charging and discharging is as anticipated. So all of these different lead acid technologies have different behaviors in terms of preferred depth of discharge, in terms of cycle life. But again, if your batteries are for emergency purposes only, it's okay if you design towards low cycling, high depth of discharge, low cycle life, as long as you're setting expectations with a customer. So preparing them so that after a few instances, you may see the voltage of your bank not getting back up to exactly how you would expect in the first time you used it. That's okay. But setting expectations on how the bank should perform over time is really important. And I want that to be part of the conversation in the beginning, because it affects the cost of the battery bank up front. Lithium. So lithium battery technology is very new in the grand scheme of things if you look at how long we've had lead acid going for. And there are a ton of different types of batteries. And I want to note that this chart came from Sonin, who is a lithium ferrophosphate option. So that's the disclaimer. When we're looking at different lithium ion technologies, there are a lot of different features that they might have, meaning you consider safety, you consider size, you consider longevity in the same way you would do that with lead acid. But something I want to point out, the moral of the lithium story that I want you to take away from today is, think about the megawatt hour throughput. You are going to be spending more upfront on a lithium ion battery, period, full stop. However, if you look at the megawatt hour throughput of a battery, so let's just say, I don't know, it ranges, let's say between, I don't even want to guess here, but let's just pick a number and say, I am looking at a battery and it has a 20 megawatt hour throughput. If you calculate that you're going to be using however many kilowatt hours a day and you're cycling it daily, you have a little bit better way of understanding how long that battery will last based on the megawatt hour throughput. We're not really talking in terms of depth of discharge anymore, because the lithium can go from 100 to 80% of the discharge, and that will not necessarily affect the longevity. Megawatt hour throughput is the kind of gold standard on evaluating the life of a lithium battery. So I want to make sure that people might get sticker shock, but then you have to say this is designed or warranted to last based on this amount of time, which is going to be significant. So considering the dollars per megawatt hour throughput is going to be a more holistic way of identifying the value of a lithium battery bank. Again, we come to capacity. So when you look at your loads and you look at your run times, both of those are going to equate to the total size of your bank. And when it seems like, how can it be that, 1 day versus 2 days, it's just one more day, I just want to have one more day of backup. But going from 1 day to 2 days is it's a doubling of the whole battery bank. Like if we're looking at this small carafe for coffee, and that's 10 kilowatt hour representation, and then this larger retaining tank is 30 kilowatt hours, it really kind of, the magnitude can expand very quickly when you're looking at days of autonomy. So setting expectations with customers on how much they're going to get for a specific amount of time is important, just to make sure that people are clear with, this is what I'm signing up for. I'm signing up for 1 day of backup. And I know that. And if I want more than 1 day of backup, I have to start cutting my loads, especially when you're actually in your emergency. If you find out you're having a power shutoff from PG&E and they say, we're doing this for 5 days, and I say, oh no, 5 days, I only designed for a 1 day backup. Maybe you're turning only on one light bulb instead of two, because you really need to kind of eke out all those kilowatt hours that you need. This level of precision is important when you're on a kilowatt hour to kilowatt hour evaluating basis. Enclosures. I just want to bring up battery enclosures because I think it's not something people really think about often, frankly. You can put your batteries in just like a NEMA 3R enclosure if you're putting it outside. Again, disclaimer, if you're putting it outside, make sure that it's within your operating temperature range that you're considering. There are different cabinets. This is a 2-shelf and a 3-shelf option, and this comes with the hookups. So you can kind of do a DIY enclosure, or you can get pre-assembled enclosures. Just something to consider. If climate control is an issue, making sure the battery is inside. There are a lot of, if you're looking at lithium, there's sometimes a lot of different little fine prints about where you can put your battery. So it has to be indoors, but not in an inhabitable space. I'm like, where in my house is indoors but not inhabitable? I guess a closet, sort of, but my closet's not really ventilated. Moral of the enclosure story, just make sure that your cabinet is going to be ventilated if necessary, in a climate controlled area if necessary. Just consider all these things. And if it really must be climate controlled, you can get containers with HVAC systems, which again is going to have more power needs, but may really enhance the longevity of your battery if it's in a temperature sensitive place. Okay, that was my 30-minute rendition of what costs you can associate with a battery. Jamie, I'm not sure if there are any questions. I saw a few little flashings from the chat window, so.